fine. I will, and if it isn't, that's fine.
Already set up though, the PowerPoint for the ones we did send? If we did send it, is it already set up?
Some of us have joined the 20%.
I'm just Western slackers.
Don't even go there.
But then I can use this, and it works.
Is that a clicker?
I requested a clicker.
You guys are sitting right up front
28
just to freak
times,
me out.
because I have 28 slots.
I like it. I can just go.
But also, some of us are speaking less than 15, and some of us might be speaking 2 minutes more than 15, because we've worked it out amongst ourselves, yes. I've borrowed 2 of your minutes.
I would say,
Take it.
you can like this, where you may have
2 minutes, okay.
I know.
Yeah. Okay.
Anybody can have any of my minutes
Yeah.
if they want.
Okay. Shall I start? Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the session on Western and Native American history. I'm Nancy Shoemaker, here from the University of Connecticut. And I'll introduce our speakers. Instead of popping up and down, I'll just run down the list here. They're sitting in order. It's a very well-planned conference. Kendra Field is an associate professor of history and director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts University. She is the author of Growing Up with the Country, Family, Race, and Nation After the Civil War, published by Yale University Press in 2018. This book traces her ancestors' migratory lives between the Civil War and the Great Migration. Ari Kelman is Chancellor's Leadership Professor of History and Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Planning in the College of Letters and Science at the University of California, Davis. He is the author, most recently, of Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War, and A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek. He has received many awards, including the Bancroft Prize for Misplaced Massacre and the Abbott Lowell Cummings Prize for his 2003 book, A River and Its City, The Nature of Landscape in New Orleans. He is now working on a book called For Liberty and Empire, How the Civil War Bled into the Indian Wars, and he is editor of the journal Reviews in American History. Next, we will have Heather Cox Richardson. She is a professor of history at Boston College, specializing in American political and economic history. She is the author of 5 books on the history of American politics and a public commentator whose work has appeared in The Guardian, Washington Post, New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and on Salon.com. She is currently at work on How the South Won the Civil War, A History of Democracy and Oligarchy in America, and a graphic novel covering the years from 1865 to 1904. That one is a graphic novel. We had a little debate about that in the... Stacy Smith is an associate professor of history at Oregon State University, where she specializes in the history of the American West and the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. She is the author of Freedom's Frontier, California and the Struggle over Unfree Labor, Emancipation and Reconstruction, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2013. This book won the inaugural David Montgomery Prize in U.S. Labor History from the Organization of American Historians and the Labor and Working Class History Association. She is currently working on a book on African American abolitionists and civil rights activists in the Pacific West called An Empire for Freedom. So we'll start with Kendra.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Thanks very much to Manisha and to Juliet and to the University of Connecticut for the invitation and to all of you for being here today. Let me see if, yes. Maybe. Okay, it's working. So, my brief talk today touches upon my first and second book projects. Growing Up with the Country was a family history of African American migration to the West after the Civil War, and my current book project is a history of African American genealogy, or history of our quests to know our ancestors from the Middle Passage through the present. I'm going to give a very, very brief glimpse of the family history that I did, beginning here with my grandmother as a child, and then I'll turn to thoughts on storytelling and silence in the post-emancipation era. As a child, I often heard my grandmother say, "Grandpa Coleman went back to Africa with Garvey." 2 decades later, when I learned that Garvey never made it to Africa, I asked the obvious question, who did he go with? And stumbled upon the little-known Chief Sam Back to Africa movement, in which thousands of formerly enslaved women and men raised $100,000 to purchase a German steamship and migrate to the Gold Coast in 1914. I found this movement not in Harlem, nor in Chicago, nor in the US South, per se, but in the former Creek Nation, the Black and Indian borderlands of Oklahoma. Building on such bits and pieces of lore within my own family, my first book was about the migratory lives of freedom's first generation, a generation of women and men who were born enslaved children at the time of emancipation, and together experienced the rise and fall of Reconstruction within and beyond the US South. And I told this story through the lives of some of my own ancestors, so I'm descended from 2 of the principal actors that I trace in the book, Thomas Jefferson Brown and Monroe Coleman, who were both my grandmother's grandfathers. Between 1865 and 1915, as many of you may know, tens of thousands of former slaves sought freedom through a series of experiments in land ownership, town building, and emigration activity that spanned the Mississippi Delta, Arkansas, Kansas, Indian Territory, Texas, as well as West Africa, Western Canada, Mexico, and beyond. Deepening and widening the roots of the Great Migration, I argued that their lives and choices complicate notions of the quintessential domesticity and biracialism of the nadir, what John Hope Franklin called the long dark night, revealing the deeply transnational and multiracial dimensions of freedom's first generation. Thomas Jefferson Brown, whose son is pictured here, was the son of an African-American father and an Irish mother who migrated from Arkansas to Indian Territory in the 1870s. Once there, Brown was married twice to members of the Creek and Seminole Nation, who in some cases were also, who in both cases were of African descent, and in some cases were freed people of the Creek Nation. In other cases, had never been formally enslaved by the Creek Nation. And this included my grandmother's grandmother, whose name was Julia Simon. In this period of Dawes allotment, this so-called white-looking father, as my grandmother's sisters described him, was able to secure more than 1,000 acres of land, a school, a church, and a post office, founding what they called Brownsville, a Black and Creek settlement in Indian Territory. I use Brown's story to illustrate how some early African-American settlers bolstered their claims to freedom in the post-emancipation era by crafting new identities for themselves, of course alongside white settlers, in relation to American expansion, Native Americans, and the acquisition of native land. By the time Monroe Coleman, 2 decades Brown's junior, bought the plot adjacent to Brownsville, he was participating in a much larger emigration movement. So this is the period of Black towns and settlements in the territory. This picture, by the way, is a picture of Para Bruner, whose family Thomas Jefferson Brown married into. So this was Julia Simon's uncle. I do not have a picture of most of the women in the story. Born in northeastern Mississippi in 1869 to a freed woman and, it seems, her former slave owner, Monroe Coleman, who's pictured here with his sons, migrated at the turn of the 20th century in the fervor of racial uplift and prideful Black town building and purchased a plot of land in the territory from a Creek freedman. It's a map of over 50 Black towns and settlements in the late 19th and early 20th century in Indian Territory. In the book, I explore Coleman's decision to participate in this racially self-conscious movement within the context of his early life as someone that was categorized as mulatto in Reconstruction-era Mississippi, amidst rumors of white parentage, the emergence of 20th century biracialism, and the erasure of a much more complex past in the South and the West. Throughout this so-called revolution of color and kinship, of course, class remained central. And in this vein, the third and final family branch that I trace is that of a man named Alexander Davis. This was Monroe Coleman's first cousin. He's referred to by his family, by his descendants, as a country preacher who led his cousin Monroe Coleman to the territory. In the book, I highlight their divergent experiences, shaped especially by color and class. I'm happy to talk afterwards about more on that subject. The Coleman and Davis families were in Oklahoma for only 6 years when they picked up yet again for a new immigration movement. They moved to a nearby tent city that they called South Gold Coast in 1913 and prepared for migration to present-day Ghana. So what happened in these 6 years? Jim Crow laws were adopted in Oklahoma on the eve of with statehood in 1907 that were modeled almost verbatim off of Mississippi's laws at the place that these immigrants had been coming from. In terms of political disfranchisement, grandfather clauses passed. People could no longer vote in the state after 1910, essentially. And in terms of land, there's lots of policies that emerged in this time period, as well as practices. In Ofuskie County, which is where they were living, an agreement was signed in which white farmers agreed, quote, never to rent, lease, or sell land to any person of Negro blood unless, unquote, they be located more than 1 mile from a white or Native American landowner. And then finally, racial violence, and especially lynching. So in 1911, a mob of white Oklahomans had lynched a 33-year-old woman named Laura Nelson and her 14-year-old son, LD. Mother and son were hung together over a bridge while a large crowd of men, women, and children watched. The newspaper reported that her, quote, suckling babe, her younger child, was left lying on the bridge until a neighbor picked her up and raised her. This image circulated as a postcard, like many lynching images following the event. Perhaps not surprisingly, this bridge over the South Canadian River was just a few miles from the land that would soon become known as South Gold Coast, the headquarters of the Chief Sam Back to Africa movement. And it goes without saying this was a far cry from the dream of Oklahoma as an all-black state that many people had, and that actually received momentary consideration by President Harrison just 2 decades prior. In my final chapter, I explore Coleman and Davis's responses to the political and economic constraints of Oklahoma, Jim Crow segregation, and oil speculation, including their participation in the Back to Africa movement I mentioned. I'm going to skip forward here. So people purchased stock certificates. That's an image of one stock certificate that someone had in their attic. And I will show you this ship before I move on. This was a cemetery where some of the children in particular, died during the winter while they were waiting for this ship to arrive. And this is the ship on the left that was purchased. So while I followed the lead of descendant stories to write this book, I tested their memories, hypotheses, and speculation about ancestors' lives against the archival record and the recollection of others who traveled the same routes and faced similar experiences. Over time, I grew interested in how and why certain details were retold and remembered, and others were buried or never narrated, in the distance between how the past was remembered and how it may have happened. Along the way, one of the most persistent patterns I noticed was that the family stories about slavery and freedom I heard at home were largely stories about men the family took pride in as quiet and not so quiet freedom fighters who escaped Reconstruction-era lynchings, purchased land, built schools, and fought back at white Night Riders before heading to the Creek Nation in the middle of the night. I'd probably heard the same prideful story about Grandpa Coleman arriving by train to Oklahoma, and this was kind of a reference to privilege, so he wasn't walking. Repeated 100 times before I learned to listen and probe for words about his wives or daughters, Margaret Johnson Coleman, Belle Johnson Coleman, Ida Carroll Coleman, Lorinda Coleman, whose daughters are pictured here. Yet it was the daughters and granddaughters of the men at the center of these narratives who shared them with me as a child. One of these was Marzetta Brown Wesley, my grandmother's eldest sister, who served as one of the family historians for much of the 20th century. Marzetta Wesley was one of the many women of this period who held tightly to particular versions of our family stories, serving as gatekeepers and the first line of defense against the constant threat of reputational damage. Like many of her generation, born in the 1910s, in and around the black towns of Oklahoma, Aunt Marzetta tended to tell only the best or most respectable parts of our history and our lives, for reasons that are both tragic and understandable. Historian Darlene Clark Hine has noted the many dimensions of our past that African American women of this generation, quote, believed better left unknown, unwritten, unspoken, except in whispered tones, unquote. These sorts of hidden transcripts form the roots of the respectability politics that came to dominate African American lives, family histories, and historical narratives for much of the 20th century. The oral versions of these stories rang with pride and self-determination while pointing to a haunting underside of worry, vulnerability, and trauma that was attempted to leave behind, especially the history of sexual slavery and violence. In the familial and communal narrative that emerged, Oklahoma was the future and Mississippi the past. In the context of migration, the past became a place as much as a time, and migration came to map family history and genealogy. And yet these buried secrets and conspicuous silences haunted and shaped the present in Oklahoma. This unknown history, and that was the phrase that Ralph Ellison used, he himself was an Oklahoman whose parents had migrated along this path. This unknown history includes countless stories of violence, terror, and vulnerability, stories erased or obscured by segregation, shame, and silence, stories that fail to conform to exceptionalist narratives of racial uplift, and stories that were not built to invoke pride. Shards and slices of lives, many of them were not stories at all. In his 2013 book, Family Trees, French historian François Vail has traced the history of the American preoccupation with family history and genealogy, exploring the ways in which Americans relate to their ancestors and view themselves in time. In the midst of American settler expansion, Vail has suggested, quote, family trees were a versatile means to cope with geographic, cultural, and social mobility in a rapidly changing world, unquote. For African American women and men, the post-emancipation era was just such a changing world. Indeed, these were storytelling years, and much of this storytelling took place within families and kin networks. Many African Americans attempted to rebuild family trees split by slavery and the slave trade, using family stories to anchor their children. At the same time, many freed people, as well as free-born African American men and women, tested their freedom in the post-emancipation years in ways that shaped family histories and genealogies for generations to come, right through the present, assuming new names and relations, cultivating particular family stories, while allowing other stories and other relations to fade. Some used family history and storytelling to distinguish themselves from the masses of newly emancipated freed peoples, so readily disparaged by white Southerners and Northerners alike during this time. James Oliver, for instance, was an African-American man who had escaped slavery in Arkansas before the war and resided in Santo Domingo. After the war, he returned to Arkansas, but, quote, adamantly refused to be labeled a freedman, unquote. Perhaps most dramatically, free people made decisions about how to narrate within families their multiracial past, including the history of sexual slavery in particular. I think it's critical to note that stories told behind closed doors, like the ones that I'm most interested in, were directly shaped by the stories that other Americans were telling far more publicly about the past, and in some cases broadcasting as stereotypes, from Birth of a Nation to William Archibald Dunning. In his stunning conclusion to Black Reconstruction in 1935, W.B. Du Bois wrote, "3/4 of the testimony against the Negro in Reconstruction is on the unsupported evidence of men who hated and despised Negroes and regarded it as loyalty to blood, patriotism to country, and filial tribute to their fathers, to lie, steal, or kill in order to discredit these Black folk," unquote. For Du Bois, however, quote, "what is inconceivable is that another generation should regard this testimony as scientific truth when it is contradicted by logic and by fact," unquote. Here, Du Bois captured the state of American historiography in the first half of the 20th century, driven as it was by the mainline racism of the Jim Crow era. In so doing, Du Bois creatively invoked the central hallmark of the American historical profession since its founding as a science in the late 19th century, objectivity. He also called attention to the role of violence and erasure within the development of many American families, Southern families in particular here, and in turn, US historiography after the Civil War. Against this backdrop, when W.B. Du Bois and Anna Julie Cooper came to share pieces of their own diasporic family histories, these had no place to land within the American historical profession. Oh, I've jumped ahead. This is a bit of, I can't read it myself, but it's a bit of Du Bois's rendering of his own family history within Souls of Black Folk. Meanwhile, Carter Woodson, the first and only PhD in history to have been born to formerly enslaved mother and father in the United States, could not bring his own personal history to bear, of course, in his public scholarship at the time. Indeed, such family histories and memories steered clear of the discipline of history altogether, becoming instead the stuff of African American literature, art, genealogy, collecting, and the New Negro movement. This continued through the Civil Rights era and long after the gradual integration of the academy and the profession. And I hope you'll indulge me if I share just one kind of final story here before I conclude. As many of you may know, historian Sterling Stuckey passed away in August last year. He'd entered the profession on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement and was an emeritus colleague of mine at UC Riverside. His book, titled Slave Culture, among many others, was the first history book that I was assigned to read as an undergraduate. A few years ago, I came across a 1976 interview conducted with Stuckey's mother, the poet Alma Stuckey. In it, David Roediger, who was the interviewer, commented on the extent to which Alma Stuckey's poetry drew upon the rich folklore of ex-slaves, and he asked her, "How were you exposed to this folklore, and how has it influenced your verse?" Alma Stuckey replied, "First of all, my grandparents were ex-slaves. There were many ex-slaves in Memphis when I was growing up. I was fascinated by them, much more than my brothers and sisters were. I would sit on their porches or steps and listen to their stories of slavery." During this same period, perhaps not coincidentally, Alma Stuckey's son wrote Slave Culture and other works in which he urged historians to take seriously African American folklore and storytelling as historical evidence about how enslaved and free African Americans remembered and made meaning of the past during and after emancipation. Of course, Sterling Stuckey did not mention in his book his own family narratives. To conclude, writing a first history book about my own ancestors drew me into a host of debates within the historical profession, some longstanding and others new, about the relationship between history and memory, the objectivity question, and the methods historians use. It also drew me into longstanding conversations within the Black intellectual tradition, within and beyond the academy, about whose lives, whose voices, and whose stories can and cannot count as evidence, and it led me, like many biographers and storytellers, to an interest in the personal lives and the family histories. In other words, the material conditions that have shaped the production of knowledge and historical scholarship. My current book project is about this history of African American genealogy, detailing the painstaking efforts of many generations of African Americans to know and to share their familial pasts, how these efforts were shaped by the history of slavery, emancipation, segregation, civil rights, and how these efforts in turn shaped American history. I'm also interested, as you can tell, in positioning these developments in relationship to the development of the American historical profession, as well as Black intellectual, cultural, and political traditions. In some sense, it's an attempt to historicize the very privilege of writing about one's own ancestors, my privilege of writing about my own ancestors, as a professional historian in the first half of the 21st century. It's about the hundreds of professionally trained African American historians in the second half of the 20th century who dared not use the word I or we, even when they had sources, both written and oral, within their own families. It's about the thousands of African American thinkers in the first half of the 20th century who read, wrote, and made history every day, and yet were categorically barred from the American historical profession. And it's about where millions of women, men, and children of African descent over the last 4 centuries went, privately, aesthetically, creatively, and when others were not listening, to make meaning of the past. Thank you.
I had planned, as Greg Downs knows, to do something very informal and to try and think about what it means when we talk about the West at a conference devoted to the history of Reconstruction, but I completely chickened out. And so instead, you're going to have to bear with me as I work through some impressionistic thoughts that are about a project that I've subsequently abandoned. This is all very promising, I know. It goes downhill from here. On July 5th, 1876, the New York Times printed a speech. The speech was titled "The Progress of Liberty." It had been delivered the previous day by Charles Francis Adams, about whom we've already heard today. Adams was a son and a grandson of presidents, and he tried to bridge the nation's revolutionary past and its postbellum future. He did this by celebrating the country's centennial and also its rebirth. He offered people a history lesson and an appraisal of the ongoing project of Reconstruction. Adams rejoiced that the Civil War's bloodshed had seeded the ground so that the egalitarian promise of Jefferson's Declaration could finally take deep root. He wrote, quote, "Now there is not a man who treads the soil of this broad land who in the eyes of the law does not stand on the same level with every other man," end quote. We could talk about that later if you want. Still, Adams, even in this celebratory mood, allowed that as the nation continued its evolution toward becoming a more perfect union, that its most benighted, I'm using his words there, inhabitants would necessarily have to be left behind. Adams was going to use rhetoric that was steeped in the era's currents of pseudoscience. He explained that, quote, American Indians were a primitive race, and that, quote, advance can never be one of their attributes, end quote. Adams went on, he said, the American Indian dwells only in the present, end quote. Tribal nations, therefore, would, he suggested, inevitably disappear beneath waves of settlers that were going to keep crashing westward in the wake of the Civil War. American Indians were, in other words, a static people. Their impending extinction then served as further evidence of the United States' dynamism in this moment. For Adams, the advance of liberty and the consolidation of an American empire in the West were perhaps complementary processes, but for him they proceeded along parallel rather than intersecting tracts. These two tales of the road to and from disunion and of the demise of the nation's native peoples needed to be understood in his telling as separable. But the next day, the day after the Times chronicled Adams's speech, the paper's lead story suggested that the United States' simultaneous pursuit of liberty and empire had actually collided. A headline in the Times blared, quote, "Massacre of our troops." Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer had, it was a few weeks earlier, but it took a while for news to filter east, had a few weeks earlier attacked a native encampment in Montana. Along with hundreds of his men, Custer had died in the fighting. Beginning July 7th, accounts of the Little Bighorn would dominate the Times for weeks to come. Historical happenstance that Custer's demise at the Little Bighorn occurred at nearly the same moment as the nation's 100th birthday offers us a chance to reconsider the relationship between the Indian Wars and Reconstruction. Rather than segregating these conflicts, as Adams tried to do in The Progress of Liberty, perhaps we should consider the ways in which the redefinition of liberty and the course of empire, secured through the mechanisms of settler colonialism, were inextricably intertwined. Put another way, as Reconstruction-era Americans pondered the proper size and the scope of federal authority as they thought about the rights of the states, the fluidity of racial identity, the prerogatives of citizenship that were changing, the specter of ongoing political violence, it seemed that Reconstruction, at least as it was proceeding in the West, often was going to pivot on conflict with native peoples, on Indian wars. The relationship between empire and liberty, as I've suggested in other work that I've done, grew out of the Civil War. The fight over whether slavery would expand into the West transformed, as we all know, the 1860 election into a referendum on competing visions of empire. The Republicans' Free Soil platform stood opposite the splintered Democrats' insistence that slavery's growth shouldn't be fettered, at least by federal regulation. After President Lincoln's victory in the 1860 election, seceding southern states took their congressional delegations with them. Republicans then transfigured the ensuing constitutional crisis into a kind of an opportunity to overhaul the nation's political economy and its geography. In 1862, legislators created the Department of Agriculture, passed the Morrill Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, and the Homestead Act. President Lincoln then offered citizens of the Union a deal they could volunteer to fight and receive as recompense for their patriotic sacrifices an education, access to expertise, and Western lands that would be connected by transportation networks to markets. The conquest and colonization of the West would accelerate at a breakneck pace from that point forward. Settlers, still intoxicated from the torrents of nationalism that they'd taken in during the war, brought jingoism with them west from Appomattox, and that, by the way, is totally a shout out to Heather, who's been doing this work for a really long time. During Reconstruction, they began casting diverse native nations as monolithic enemies of the United States' divinely ordained mission to conquer and colonize the trans-Mississippi lands. Federal armies, which after the war were made up of Northerners and Southerners in some instances, fought wars that eventually displaced tens of thousands of native people. In short, the Indian Wars of this era sometimes catalyzed reunion and reconciliation, as well as helping to secure promises made by the Republican Party during the Civil War to create a white man's republic, an empire for liberty in the trans-Mississippi West. A few examples. Megan said earlier that she liked lists, so this is the list portion of the talk. In the spring of 1865, with the Civil War lurching toward its final act, Cheyennes began fighting alongside Arapahoes and Lakotas. These native people were trying to turn back newly arrived traders and miners who 2 years earlier had blazed the Bozeman Trail through Wyoming's Powder River country. Federal authorities understood the stakes in this fight. They had to protect the Union's vision of an American empire, and so General Sherman sent Grenville Dodge into the field. Dodge later named the ensuing struggle for a lone Lakota leader he called the Bloody Fight, Red Cloud's War. On December 21st, 1866, after the Civil War was over, Lakotas, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes killed about 80 of Lieutenant Colonel William Fetterman's men in Wyoming. The Fetterman Massacre, as it became known, was the worst defeat, at least to that point, for the United States in its wars with the Plains tribes. This was a really embarrassing loss that raised all kinds of questions about the government's Indian policy and also about whether or not the federal government maintained a monopoly of violence in the American West. Embattled federal officials agreed to negotiate with the tribes. The two sides signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. That compact guaranteed the Lakotas the Black Hills, I'm quoting now, in perpetuity. You'll hear in a few moments how long in perpetuity lasted. That treaty also pledged that settlers would forever stay out of the Powder River country. Another case study in this list. 4 years later, a Modoc warrior named Captain Jack led followers into lava beds near the Oregon-California border. They began conducting a guerrilla war against settlers, raising questions yet again about whether the federal government had control over the nation's territory, which by then encompassed the Pacific Slope. William Sherman again sent troops into the field, this time Edward Canby, to restore the peace. A decade earlier, Canby had devised a grand plan, later known as the Long Walk, to remove Navajos from Arizona. Canby also, of course, had helped to quell the New York City draft riots, leaving Sherman confident that his subordinate would be able to negotiate a settlement with what seemed to Sherman like, quote, a ragtag band of savages. But on April 11th, 1873, Captain Jack and his men murdered Canby and also another peace commissioner. The Modoc Raiders also wounded Alfred Meekum, their Indian agent. When Meekum recovered from his wounds, this took him months, he began advocating for reform in federal Indian policy. He started traveling around the United States, lecturing before large audiences about the importance of tribal sovereignty, railing against the spiraling costs of an American empire in the trans-Mississippi West. The Modocs' plight, he said, demonstrated the bankruptcy of federal Indian policy. His activism, coupled with Canby's death, prompted a crisis of confidence, at least among some federal policymakers, all of which leads us back to the banks of the Little Bighorn River. In 1874, George Custer claimed that an expedition that he'd led had found gold in the Black Hills. As news of that gold strike filtered back east, a torrent of pioneers inundated the Lakota's sacred places. Tribal leaders, including Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, threatened to attack settlers. General Sherman, yet again, dispatched, in this case, troops that were stationed in the West already to try to keep a fragile peace. In late 1875, though, the federal government decided that it was going to ignore the Fort Laramie Agreement. It stopped evicting prospectors from the Black Hills. The Lakotas and their allies, again, Northern Cheyennes for the most part, took up arms. In June of 1876, as the United States prepared to celebrate its centennial, the Allied tribes won their victory at the Little Bighorn. Early in his first term, President Grant had hoped that feeding rather than fighting Indians would allow federal authorities to civilize and acculturate native nations into the United States and also clear the way for further settlement in the West. But the combined humiliations of Red Cloud's War, the Modoc War, and the Great Sioux War, especially the slaughter at the Little Bighorn, coupled with an array of political scandals that all of you know more about than I do, I suspect, diminished support for Grant's peace policy. And also, I would suggest, helped to undermine faith in the federal government's Reconstruction-era social engineering projects. Self-styled realists, including General Sherman's brother, Senator John Sherman, argued that authorities had for too long coddled native nations, suggesting that American Indians in some instances were being treated better than veterans of the United States Civil War. So here's just a final case, the Nez Perce War, which extinguished flickering hopes that Grant's peace policy could be salvaged, and also, I would suggest, further hobbled Reconstruction. In 1876, Nez Perce people began following Chief Joseph, threatening settlers in the Pacific Northwest, and suggesting, yet again, that federal control of the West was uncertain at best. Chief Joseph's bands insisted that the government had illegally dispossessed them. Settlers then insisted that federal authorities, having promised them the West during the Civil War, now had to step up and protect them. William Sherman, again, sent in this case Oliver Otis Howard to quiet this insurgency, as it was being called. Howard was a veteran of Gettysburg, former administrator of the Freedmen's Bureau. He was a kind of an emblem of the idea that the federal government could solve even the most intractable social problems. As Howard traveled west, recriminations lingered in the wake of the Great Sioux War. Redeemers ran roughshod in the South, and the 1876 election remained undecided. In the end, Congress, of course, awarded the election to Rutherford Hayes. Hayes then withdrew federal troops from positions around the state houses in South Carolina and Louisiana, further undermining confidence in federal power. Less than 2 months after President Hayes' inauguration, Oliver Howard warned the Nez Perce that they had just 30 days to return to their reservation. Instead of complying, Chief Joseph and his people decided that they would run. In the fall of 1877, though, the Nez Perce finally decided that they needed to rest. They'd already traveled more than 1,000 miles. Federal troops caught up with them and surrounded them on October 5th, 1877. Chief Joseph, with his people caught, surrendered and reportedly said, quote, "I'm tired, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever," end quote. The Indian Wars were in some ways over, as was Reconstruction. The United States had, at least to some extent, secured its empire in the American West. When Charles Francis Adams disentangled these histories of Native peoples and of the Civil War and Reconstruction, he insisted that Indians would simply disappear when confronted with the onrush of settler civilization. But rather than vanishing, the region's indigenous peoples fought. They fought for sovereignty, they fought for determination. These are struggles that continue today, of course. And it seems with this conference and a lot of other work that's being done right now that the time may finally have come to write Native Americans back into the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction in the West. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to Manisha for inviting me. And also, I'm very pleased to be here because of the kind of audience that's here. I think is a lot of really bright minds doing really good stuff, so I thought I would take this opportunity to try out some new ideas. God help you. So what I want to argue today is that the West is significant just for today. I think you can argue it in a lot of different ways, but for today, for me, the West is significant because, as you know, I study ideology and politics, thanks to the gentleman who's sitting in the back row back there, who was never my advisor officially, but certainly was the mentor to my entire intellectual career. Thank you very much, Dr. Foner. But if you take a look then at ideology and politics during the Civil War, and especially during Reconstruction, I think the West, at least today, I think the West takes on a different kind of significance than I have understood it to have in the past, and that's thanks to a new project I'm working on. So what I'm going to argue today is that the West is significant during Reconstruction because it is in the West that the ideology of the Confederacy takes on a new life. And it does so because of the structure, the history of the West, the structure of the Western economy from the 1870s onward, and ultimately to this really weird political moment of the 1890s in which Westerners organized to work with the South and to dominate American politics going forward. You with me on that so far? All right, so let me walk you through it. So first of all, let's start with the conflict between Confederate ideology, which suggested that the world of society should be formulated according to hierarchies, and the Northern ideology, which suggested that, in fact, that was not the case, that human beings should be created equal. And again, we could argue that at great length, but if you're with me on that, I can get to the new material. From that, of course, you know that when the Republican Party took over the government during the Civil War, it went ahead and recreated the nation, as Ari Kelman has so well pointed out. It recreated a nation that was designed to create equality of opportunity across the board for men, which is not significant today for me, that the government should reflect the opportunity for individuals to rise in American society, and obviously, I love that image, constructing the nation. And then obviously they take that forward with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So theoretically, by 1865 to 1865, 1868, and 1870, you have in the East a world in which the government should be promoting equality of opportunity for all men. What I want to argue today is that that was not the case in the West. That when the settlers from the East go to the West immediately after the Civil War, they not only bring their own ideas with them, but they go into a society which looks much more like the Confederacy than it ever looked like the American North. And you all know this, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. But you know, before the beginning of the Civil War, the American West, west of the Mississippi, was largely small T territories, that is, land that had not yet been organized by the American government. And yet, by the end of the Civil War, the U.S. Congress had taken under their control most of that land and had divided it into a grid that looks very much like it does today, with the exception of the fact they hadn't yet divided the Dakotas in half, which happens in 1889, and they hadn't yet broken off Wyoming. That land west of the Mississippi had a completely different story than the American East did. It rooted itself in the Alamo and in Davy Crockett rather than in Jamestown and George Washington. And that history, I'm going to argue, really mattered because, as we all know, and this is not at all original to me, this is a land that had, before the acquisition of that land by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, it was a land characterized by hierarchies. It was characterized by Indian slavery immediately after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. You had Mexican lynching in quite high numbers. There are at least 163 Mexicans lynched in the California lands between 1848 and 1860. Anglos begin to refer to Mexicans as filthy, ignorant, lazy, and vicious. I should point out again, this is not my material. I'm only at this point bringing in the terrific work of people who have done it other than me. We know, of course, this is also a land characterized by hierarchies of law in the western states, like California, which in 1850 declared that citizenship was limited to free white persons, and that's going to matter in a few minutes under a law of 1802. There's a series of laws from 1890 to 1802 that are very important in the West. And of course, California provides in 1854 that only white people can testify against white people in court, and then we also have the foreign miners tax of 52 as well. We also have, before the Civil War and during the Civil War, the rise of a concept that Mexican Americans are different than Anglo-Americans, and this is personified, of course, by Juan Cortina, and I'm going to do a little bit of advertising here. Somebody needs to write a popular biography of this dude. He's absolutely fascinating, and there really isn't any stunning biography of him yet. He looks at the fact that the American laws are discriminating against the Mexican landowners in the land that had been acquired by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and he starts to march out against them, and he gives us the concept of the Western Mexican bandit, which is a term he embraces enthusiastically by 59. All right, so the Civil War is supposed to end all this, right? We've got this whole free society. Of course, you know that's not the case, because we have, of course, a number of things that happened during the war that reinforce rather than destroy hierarchies in the West. And I'm going to mention only three of them, the first of which is the Dakota War of '62, in which the Dakotas rise up against the settlers in the land that they had given up under the Treaty of 1851, in part because they are not being provided with the annuities and the food that's promised under the Treaty of 51. And that gives us our our largest mass execution in American history, December 26, 1862, when 38 Dakotas are executed at once in Minnesota. That mass execution then is succeeded by a further dehumanization of the Indian peoples there with the Long March of early January 1864, coincidentally, not maybe coincidentally, really sparked by the same Kit Carson, who is one of the early Indian fighters in the West. That's early '64, in which the Navajo are marched across several hundred miles and essentially put into a concentration camp. And then, of course, in late '64, I really am embarrassed even to mention this with Ari Kelman sitting beside me, but there's this little thing that happens in Colorado. Somebody probably ought to write a book about it. Did not shout out to Megan Nelson about the Long March. Sorry about that, Megan. See, I learned. After the war, we tend to talk about the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. But of course, the Western states are writing their own new legislatures, their own new laws. The new territories and state legislatures writing their own laws, and all of them hark back to a series of laws written between 1790 and 1802, the naturalization laws that say you cannot be a citizen unless you are free and white. These are, of course, laws that were rooted in slavery, but they carry over quite naturally into the West, where in 1870, Nevada quite on the table says we will not approve of the 15th Amendment if it applies to Indians or Chinese. So the 15th Amendment, according to Westerners, only applied to African Americans. It should not affect their lives, they thought. At the same time, you have the rise of the concept of this new American, this new individualistic American, the cowboy, who is living in an era in which he represents an individual, a white individual, even though a third of the cowboys are men of color, but he's living in this society, which is a hierarchical society. He represents individualism and equality. In fact, he's living in a world that explicitly does not have those things. Are you with me so far on this? I know it's a ton of material, and we haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. Good so far? All right. This cowboy is a symbol in part because the Western economy is an extractive economy that looks far more like the cotton economy that Sven Beckert has written so incredibly well about than it does to any kind of concept that Lincoln ever had. We have a lot of very rich men and a few very rich men and a lot of workers who work for them. And because of that, we have the rise of a very few very wealthy, prominent men who tend to dominate American politics, not only in their time, but also with their legacies. People like William Sharon, who essentially bankrolled the Comstock lodes, the Comstock mines in Nevada, and who is, well, let's call him richer than God, and who marries his daughter off to his impoverished lawyer, which is going to matter in a minute. Who cares, right? No one cares about these guys because they're Westerners, they don't have any votes, right? Here's Reconstruction. What happens is, as you know, in 1880, the South goes solidly the South goes solidly Democratic. And Republicans recognize that they need to pick up votes somewhere. So where do they look? They look at the obvious place here, which is California. California is the one state in 1880 that was on the fence between the two parties. So what do they do to pick up California in the next election? They start to embrace the idea that, in fact, the world really should be characterized by hierarchies. And in 1882, we get a Republican president signing the Chinese Exclusion Act. Doesn't work. 1884, of course, we know that the South goes solidly Democratic, and it's there to stay until Tennessee votes for Harding in 1920. When that happens, the Republican Party quite deliberately has to move west, and we have, from 1889 to 1890, in a 12-month period, the largest acquisition of American states since the original 13. Interestingly enough, the Eastern Democrats, Eastern Republicans believe that picking up the West is going to put their program back in power. That's not what happens, because Westerners have far more in common with the South than they do with the East. And what they end up doing is, in 1891, and this is the cool new stuff, I hope you're with me so far, 1891, Westerners organize as a political Congress. They organize a group called the Trans-Mississippi Congress. They meet twice a year. They root themselves, as I say, in the Alamo and Kit Carson. They say that the day is coming when they are going to be more important than the American Congress. They organize without regard to party, and they say they are, quote, no longer wild and woolly, but instead they want to, quote, convey to our government, to our friends in the East, that we are developing, that we are increasing in strength, and that the new empire of the West is being consolidated, and that we are fast becoming a commercial, political, and intellectual center. And what do? In fact, they start to work with the South. The same time when we get the image of people like Buffalo Bill, we also get an increasing emphasis on Western massacres, both of people of color and of workers. I'm sorry, I know this is fast here. But we also get, in America, spreading west from this link between the South and the West ideologically, which is in a minute going to become actual voting. Ideologically, we get the rise of Confederate statues from 1890 to 1920, and the rise of people like Frederick Jackson Turner and Teddy Roosevelt saying everything's about the West and the individualism of the West. The individualism that depends on people of color and women, whom I'm not going to talk about today, people of color being in a lesser category. Okay, so far? That sounds a lot like the Confederacy, doesn't it? It ought to. From this, we get written into American society legal hierarchies quite deliberately at the turn of the century through the insular cases, which give us the idea that we can have territory that is domestic in a foreign sense. That was written by an ancestor of William Barr. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Strike that if it's being taped. We also get the concept that there are some people who are not citizen material. We get the concept of non-citizen nationals. And this happens, of course, right during the rise of both Jim Crow and Juan Crow, which we always forget about, Jim Crow and Juan Crow laws, systems. We get the period of a high increase in both Black African-American lynching, Indian lynching, and Mexican lynching, anybody who could be portrayed as trying to reach above his station. It goes beyond that, though, this reach of that Confederate ideology into the actual government. The South and the West begin to work together beginning in the 1890s with this Trans-Mississippi Congress, which becomes a Trans-Mississippi Commercial Congress shortly after that, with water laws. This is where we get the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902, and Newlands is the formerly poor lawyer that William Sharon married his daughter to. We get things like the Newlands Act, which Teddy Roosevelt said was the most important thing he had done, but we also get with Francis Newlands the powerful nationalization of that Confederate ideology that they embraced during Reconstruction. So the other thing Newlands is famous for is trying to get the 15th Amendment repealed. He is an open white supremacist who actually makes a list, just because it seems to be the theme, of people by color, listing which colors are better than others. But it's not just Democrats. Newlands is a Silverite who becomes a Democrat. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. No, I told you about Newlands. It's also Western Republicans. So when we look at the fall of the 1921 Lynching Act, and everybody thinks that that is a Southern Democratic thing that kills the Lynching Act, in fact, the guy who kills the Anti-Lynching Act of 1921 is William Borah of Idaho, who is a progressive Republican. He's a progressive Republican. He is the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he says that he does not want that law because, working with his Southern Democratic colleagues, he believes it attacks states' rights. Eastern Democrats are so frustrated with these, Eastern Republicans are so frustrated with these Western Republicans that they call them the sons of the wild jackass, and says that nobody should pay any attention to them or to Southerners who are from backward, nothing states. That pisses off the Western Republicans so much that they are willing to be courted by somebody else. This is, again, also the same period when we get the resurrection of the Southern Democratic ideology across the country, embraced, first of all, by Mark Hanna's brother-in-law, James Ford Rhodes, who writes the first, yep, I saw those eyes go up, who writes the first history of the U.S. that anticipates the Dunning School. Dunning actually, in Rhodes's early drafts, he actually footnotes a paper by Dunning that is going to become Dunning's first book. Those Sons of the Wild Jackass can be picked up by anybody, and who picks them up? FDR. Quite deliberately recognizes that the time is ripe for those Western Republicans to be picked off and to join again with the Southern Democratic Party. So what I hope I outline for you today is that it is in time for us to take on the West, not only Reconstruction historians in the Southern concept, but the late 19th century, the West as its own political and ideological concept, based in a different history, a different economy, and a different political structure that works far better with the Confederate Reconstruction South than it does with the North. Thank you very much.
All righty. Well, thanks so much for that. I actually think that we're going to have some connections among the papers. And of course, along with all of my fellow panelists, I want to thank Manisha and Juliet for putting together the conference and UConn for hosting us. It's really been a great time so far, and I'm learning a lot. So I'm a historian of the Western United States, and I've spent pretty much most of my career so far engaged in kind of two projects as I see them. The first is reimagining what national history would look like if we understood the West as central rather than peripheral to the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. And then the second project is trying to kind of reframe emancipation and Reconstruction as profoundly multiracial processes that involve Native people, Latinos, and people of Asian ancestry, in addition to African Americans and white Americans. In short, I've been part of a big group of historians, including all of the panelists here, who've been kind of gradually unsettling North-South, black-white, slave-free binaries of national history and pushing, by pushing the story farther and farther west. So my project is, new project is on African American abolitionists and civil rights activists on the Pacific coast of North America in the from about the 1840s to the 1880s. And the project still unsettles that familiar regional set of boundaries of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but it actually, different from my previous work, puts African Americans back at the heart of the story. And I ask how the black freedom struggle of the 19th century looks different if we move the center of action to a place where African Americans were not just the smallest racial minority, but vastly outnumbered by people of Asian, Latin American, and American Indian ancestry. And I also consider how black activists' struggle for equality on the Pacific coast changed the legal and political terrain of Reconstruction, not only in the far west, but in some ways I would also say nationally. So today I'm going to just give a fairly brief analysis of 3 ways, we're doing lists, right? 3 ways in which the activism of California African Americans shifted the terms of Reconstruction in the far west, and to some degree in the nation at large. So specifically, I'm going to consider how campaigns for black testimony rights redefined the legal status of other non-white Californians, how black men's suffrage in California affected the fortunes of the Republican Party, both in California and in national politics, and then how foreign-born black Californians' quest for citizenship helped reshape federal naturalization policies. So I'll first talk about testimony. Black Californians had been campaigning for equality in the witness box for about 12 years, when finally in 1863, they managed to overturn California's ban on African American testimony against whites in the courts. And in doing this, they both directly and indirectly redefined the legal status of Chinese immigrants in California. So in 1863, black activists finally convinced the state legislature to repeal the ban on African Americans testifying against whites in criminal and civil cases. But repeal came with a hitch that most black activists did not anticipate. California's Republican majority legislature refused to adopt race-neutral testimony laws. Instead, the staunch advocates of repeal had to agree to a compromise measure that granted complete testimony rights to people of African descent, but perpetuated prohibitions against Native American testimony and critically explicitly banned for the first time all Chinese evidence against whites in the courts. That actually wasn't in the statutes explicitly, but it was a precedent of the California Supreme Court from 1854 that had established that Chinese people could not testify in the courts against whites. Okay. So the explicit ban on Chinese testimony against whites, which was an indirect result of black activists' 1863 campaign for colorblind testimony laws, created an important legal oddity for both black and Chinese Californians during Reconstruction. Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act in 1866 in an attempt to vest African Americans with the status and civil protections of citizens. This act, as we all well know, declared all people born on U.S. soil except Indians not taxed, an important distinction, declared them to be citizens, and it extended to these newly made citizens, quote, the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of persons and property as is enjoyed by white citizens. And this is important to my story, so that's why I'm emphasizing those words. In California, white citizens enjoyed immunity from Chinese testimony. The question soon emerged of whether African Americans in California had the same immunity, and the California Supreme Court decided that they did. In 1867, the court overturned the robbery and assault conviction of a black man named George Washington because the only evidence against him came from a Chinese victim and witnesses. The court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 extended protection against Chinese testimony to Washington because he was a black citizen entitled to all of the rights of white citizens. So astonishingly, or maybe not if you know your California history, this interpretation held in the California state courts despite the ratification of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights/Enforcement Act of 1870. Both of these pieces of legislation ostensibly could be read, and were read in many circumstances, to extend testimony rights to all persons, not just citizens, living in the jurisdiction of the United States. But the California Supreme Court nonetheless ruled in 1871 that the ban on Chinese testimony did not violate the U.S. Constitution or federal statutes because no one, white, black, or Chinese, could use Chinese witnesses to defend their claims in court. Such prohibitions, the majority ruling said, quote, dispensed equal justice to all, end quote. So the ban on Chinese testimony only ended when California legislators quietly dropped it during a general overhaul of the state's criminal and civil codes in 1872. So despite their small numbers here, and I should point out that African Americans make up about 1% of the California population in this period, their struggle for colorblind testimony laws in 1863 had unintended but pretty critical repercussions for the civil and legal rights of Chinese immigrants. It resulted in explicit exclusion from the witness box that persisted for almost a decade in spite of federal Reconstruction law. I'll also argue second today that despite their small numbers, California African Americans actually had an outsized influence on the political fortunes of the Republican Party at the municipal, county, state, and to some extent I would even say national levels of government. California pretty famously rejected the 15th Amendment after Democrats retook the state government. California did not ratify the 15th Amendment until 1962. Now, historians have attributed this rejection to anti-Chinese sentiment, specifically Democrats' accusations, and Heather was talking about this, accusations that the Chinese would, with Republicans' help, seek citizenship and then make up 16.5% of the entire California electorate. Now, the emphasis on Chinese men's potential voting impact has in some ways obscured the actual impact of black men's voting in California. And on the surface, this makes a lot of sense. African American men of voting age amounted to only 1,731 people, and just under 1% of the electorate. They seem, on the surface, like a negligible voting bloc, and I think that's how most Western historians have treated them. But that argument actually ignores the critical importance of what I might call political microclimates, especially during Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. The major parties won and lost presidential elections by razor-thin margins of the popular vote in this era, and gerrymandering and machine politics gave small groups of voters, especially those in urban areas, outsized influence over municipal, state, and congressional elections. So in this context, California's 1,731 potential African-American voters could and did change the elections of the Reconstruction era in some fairly significant ways. So consider this. In 1868, Grant won the popular vote in California and took the state's 5 electoral votes. And he did so, though, by the thinnest of thin margins, 520 votes, or a minuscule 0.4% of the popular vote, less than 1/2 of 1 percentage point. Right? So by 1870, with the resurgence of the Democratic Party fully underway, especially in California, Republicans very much took seriously the idea that a handful of black California men who would become voters could change the dynamics of regional and maybe even national politics. Black votes finally, after the 15th Amendment, black votes finally shifted San Francisco County over to the Republicans in 1871 in the gubernatorial elections, and in 1872 in that presidential election as well. Black voters were also responsible for Republican victories over most Democratic candidates in the 1870 and 1872 San Francisco municipal elections. And black voters may have played a fairly important role, I think, too, in Rutherford B. Hayes gaining California's 6 electoral votes in 1876. Hayes beat Tilden in California by 2,798 votes statewide, about 1.8% of the total popular vote, and by only 748 votes in San Francisco County. Black Californians estimated 1,000 to 1,500 ballots, including around 800 in the city of San Francisco, may well have been a major asset to Republicans in a highly contested election in which Hayes ultimately won by a single electoral vote. So none of this is to say that somehow California's tiny block of black voters played this transformative role in post-war politics, but it does remind us that small numbers on the ground did not mean that black people on the West Coast were inconsequential or negligible. These interesting political microclimates allowed them actually to wield far more political power than we might initially imagine. So I'll end today by considering Black Californians' role in reshaping the naturalization law of the United States during Reconstruction. And part of the reason that African American men became voters and Chinese men did not was because the 15th Amendment applied only to citizens of the United States. Chinese-born people were not and could not become U.S. citizens because of the Federal Naturalization Act of 1790. And under that act, only free white persons could apply to become naturalized citizens of the United States. So oddly enough, in pursuing citizenship status for people of African descent born abroad, Black Californians unintentionally and unwittingly, this was not their goal, but it kind of came as an upshot of it, helped set off a debate over federal naturalization law that cemented the exclusion of Chinese nationals and other Asians from applying for citizenship. Sorry, I keep getting too close to that. In March 1870, Edwin A. Clark wrote to the Republican senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, to draw his attention to the plight of black men who would not be able to vote after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. Clark was a black resident of San Francisco, and more importantly, for the purposes of our story, he was a native of Jamaica who had been in the United States since 1844. While his US-born black neighbors eagerly registered as voters, Clark and his Caribbean-born compatriots could only stand on the sidelines because they could not become citizens or voters. Quote, "I keenly feel that an odious discrimination in the laws deprive me of the privilege of becoming in law what I have always been at heart, a loyal American citizen," Clark wrote to Sumner, and he asked the senator to strike the word white out of the federal naturalization laws. So just in case Sumner wasn't motivated by the base unfairness of this racial discrimination, Clark assured the aged senator that there were another 300 foreign-born black men in the city of San Francisco who could help give Republicans secure control over California in future elections. So here's evidence that people at the time understand the importance of these political microclimates. Indeed, California, and what's very interesting about this that I did not expect, is that California ranked 5th in the nation for the number of foreign-born people of African descent living in the United States in 1870. We can talk about that later. So in the summer of 1870, Sumner did just what Clark was hoping he would do. He proposed an amendment to a lengthy naturalization bill pending before Congress, which overhauled and reformed the federal naturalization codes, citing the Declaration of Independence, appropriate because the most heated debate over this amendment happened on the 4th of July, 1870, when Congress is doing an extended session in order to get done before the end of the term. He passionately advocated expunging all racialized language from federal naturalization law. Clark was certainly not the driving force behind Sumner's amendment. Sumner's motivation was undoubtedly his own radical egalitarianism born of his anti-slavery roots. It is, however, clear that the plight of Clark and his California compatriots moved the senator from Massachusetts. Sumner referenced Clark's letter 3 times in the naturalization debate, and he read it in its entirety on the floor of the Senate. This may have been strategic. Sumner may have been hoping to kind of soften up Western Republican senators with a promise of enhanced political power in San Francisco by talking about how foreign-born black men would bolster the Republican fortunes there. Now, the amendment to eliminate the word white from federal naturalization laws had results that Clark likely did not anticipate when he made his initial plea to Sumner. Most senators, including Sumner's fellow Republicans, attacked the amendment not with anti-black vitriol, but with bitter denunciations of Chinese immigrants. Pacific Coast Republicans not only shot down Sumner's proposal for race-neutral naturalization laws, they urged the Senate to insert more racialized language into these laws, specifically a clause denying naturalization to Chinese nationals specifically. Republicans finally settled on a compromise. This was a clause that extended naturalization rights to, quote, aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent, end quote, rather than making the law colorblind. So just as we saw in the 1863 campaign for testimony rights, African Americans' quest for colorblind, race-neutral citizenship kept running up against the Chinese question in the West. Instead of eliminating race from the formulation of citizenship, kind of getting rid of that white, non-white binary in the 1790 law, legislators instituted an even more complex kind of tripart racial schema for determining eligibility for naturalization. They put white and people of African descent on the same footing while rendering Asians as, quote, persons incapable of becoming citizens, as they would be known in the legal language of the time. Between 1870 and 1880, only 100 black Californians would naturalize under the new law. But this tripart immigration system, born of their efforts to gain citizenship, kept Asian immigrants from naturalizing for another 80 years. So all of this, I think, belies the notion that Black Pacific populations were too small or insubstantial to matter really much in the bigger story of Reconstruction. In many ways, their struggles for colorblind, race-neutral legislation led in unintended ways to actually an elaboration of a new racial schema that would last for decades, starting from Reconstruction. That's all I got.
Okay, I hope everyone heard that. I liked how Dick Brown at the previous session summed it up. So I'll just very quickly say he's asking Ari and Heather why they assume this hard and fast border between the United States and Canada in this time period.
I'm not sure if this is working or not. Oh, okay, it is. Great. I don't think that I don't think incorporating the northern border into this story would necessarily change the narrative, but I do think that it would. I think it would buttress the story to some extent, particularly around the various kinds of anxiety on the part of the federal government around its ability to project power into the West. And I would actually go to the period even prior to Reconstruction and look at one incident that Heather alluded to, which is the Dakota War of 1862 leading up to the hanging of the Dakota 38. Little Crow, when he runs out of options during the Dakota War, makes a decision. He looks for allies in the Dakota Territory and looks elsewhere, and eventually ends up going to Fort Garry in Manitoba because he says that his grandfather had fought with the British during the War of 1812, and that his people had been promised that the British would make good on a debt that they owed him. And so he wanted British troops stationed at Fort Garry to open an additional front in the Civil War, which would have allowed the Dakotas, who at that point were very badly divided in that struggle, potentially to keep their fight going. And that event has a very long tail. There are a number of instances in which federal authorities point back to anxiety over the permeable nature of the northern boundary, which I think lead to a great deal of, as I said earlier, anxiety in this period.
I want my borders because I'm asking a different question. I think you can certainly do Native history, and you should do Native history without borders, except to the degree that they were considered, medicine lines, so that the Army couldn't chase you from one country to another, both in the North and the South. But since what I'm interested in is the relationship between ideology and government, and I'm interested in the story of America as a political entity, as a body of laws, it doesn't make any sense at all for me to go into other countries, except to the degree that America does. So I don't think it works for the questions I'm asking, because they are deliberately bounded.
Yes. Yes. So you are. Kate Messer was asking about why it is some individuals really become keepers of the family stories about slavery or the past.
Yeah, thank you for that really, really insightful question. More often those are more often the people that do become historians of one kind or another. I've found, but that's just anecdotal. I mean, I tend to. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but it does kind of link to my kind of interest in kind of the unevenness of like what we inherit when it comes to stories and also silences, and the diversity of relationships to that, even in diversity within a single family and of course within a single community. So that's why I'm always interested in kind of intra-communal dynamics, but also familial dynamics. And that, people I think when I say I do family history think very romantic things, but I then say, well, no, I'm actually a Marxist family historian. Because what I think is that stories have value and very material value, especially in the post-emancipation period. And so sometimes it's the case that, one child, or depending on how life turns out for different siblings, and the diversity of life paths people take, those stories have different kinds of value to one descendant over the other. And sometimes it's some childhood, trauma or absence, or the kind of luck of the draw of growing up with a grandparent. In my case, I grew up with very close to my grandmother in East Orange, New Jersey, and she was kind of she was rebellious among all the sisters. The other ones kind of kept the respectability thing going, and she wanted to kind of rebel against it and tell all these secrets. And I have plenty of cousins who didn't get the stories that I got. Yeah. So.
In the far back corner in the blue shirt, hand waving. Okay, so the question is largely for Heather and Stacy, and is asking if you could explain the origins of the cultural hierarchies that your papers reference.
Yeah, so I think as Heather pointed out, and I sort of implicitly talked about, that definitely there are racial hierarchies in the West, but they look different. I don't know that I would necessarily say they're more complicated, but they certainly have a lot of components, and some of that is of course, an inheritance of the Spanish and Mexican regimes, right? A lot of the hierarchy that conquering Americans encounter when they go west are Mexican landlords who have American Indian debt peons or slaves, and that becomes kind of the first slavery that white Westerners become very concerned about in the West, and then eventually talking quite a bit more about African American slavery going west as well. So there's already a kind of set of racial hierarchies and labor systems in California in place. I argue in my first book, at least, that these kind of collide with American racial systems, creating very odd and maybe unexpected types of hierarchies and labor systems that are multi-part. I mean, for instance, you also have Hawaiians in these different hierarchies who are ranked maybe perhaps slightly above Native Americans and African Americans, but definitely kind of had lower political and legal status than, let's say, Chinese nationals. So it's in some ways I would argue it's a clash of these different colonial cultures in the 19th century that, in California's case at least, creates a pretty complicated set of racial and legal hierarchies, and sometimes that unexpected things happen. George Washington, the man I talked about here, gets immunity from Chinese testimony because all of a sudden the Civil Rights Act of 1866 has made him legally white in a way that is just kind of unimaginable that this happens exactly the same way in other places.
Yeah, I'd say first of all, Stacy's first book is fabulous on this, and it also draws the idea of there being hierarchies in the West come from the colonialism of that region, but also, again, there's also, for a graduate student, there's also a lot of good work in colonial Latin American history that talks about this. But you can also see this kind of concept not only existing in the colonial what was the borderlands of Latin America. You can see people tracing this idea through Latin American history and now in the history of capitalism, the idea that certain economic systems, and I would argue certain cultural systems, tend to replicate themselves on a certain landscape. So I think I would build on what Stacy said about the history and suggest that there is also environment in there. There is also economics in there, and then and politics, of course, which spin from those two things. But ultimately, I'd like to add another layer on that and to suggest that once you have a base layer that suggests a pattern on which people will arrange themselves, that pattern is replicated through language. That once you have a system of hierarchy, you start to develop a culture, a religion, and a whole system around that replicates itself. And my big thing about how it does so is through imagery and language.
So unfortunately, our time is up if we are to have a break before the next panel starts at 3:30. So thank our panelists.